Hello, I'm Org, and in this video I'm going to review the Polikarpov I-16 Early, the Tier 3 Soviet multi-role fighter. Honestly, this aircraft is, if anything, overpowered considering the tier it is in, and also the tactics that dominate Tier 3. Essentially, this aircraft is a heavily armed and robust turn fighter, in a tier where everything will try to turn with you. Before we get into the I-16 and World of Warplanes, let me talk a bit about the aircraft's history. The I-16 was designed by Polikarpov as the I-15 was nearing completion. However, the I-16 was a very different aircraft, where the I-15 was a fabric-covered biplane with a fixed undercarriage and open canopy. The I-16 was a low-wing monoplane with some aluminium covering on a mixed metal and wooden airframe, with a retractable undercarriage and an enclosed cockpit. At first, this design was believed to be too radical for the Soviet Air Force academies, but their objections were quickly overcome, and the aircraft was ordered into production 1 month before the first prototype flew. Now, when this aircraft was flown in 1934, it was found to be very manoeuvrable, although none of the test pilots found it to be a pleasant aircraft to fly, and that was a characteristic that was to stick with this aircraft throughout its career. Now, a number of changes were made, resulting in the I-16 Type 5, which was the initial major production variant. The I-16 was fast for its time and was very light, resulting in a high power to weight ratio and a very good climb rate. It also had a fantastic rate of roll and a good rate of turn. However, the pilots still had numerous problems with the aircraft, ranging from the canopy getting jammed shut, the landing gear being heavy to raise and lower, and that was something that had to be done manually. But it went to serve in a number of theatres over a very long period of time for the time period. The I-16 had its combat debut in the Spanish Civil War with mixed results. The Soviet government sent hundreds of I-16s with volunteer pilots to fight for the Republican side in the war. In the initial stages, the I-16 was very competitive. It was essentially able to stick with the nationalist biplane fighters, the CR-32 and Heinkel-51, in turns, and it could outrun those aircraft. However, soon the Germans started sending early variants of the Bf-109 to Spain. The I-16s could outperform them at low altitude and in the climb, but the Germans had an advantage in terms of speed, in particular dive speed. Towards the end of the war, newer variants of the 109 would completely outclass the I-16. But more importantly, the I-16s were defeated by the superior tactics of the nationalist forces. At the start of the war, all the air forces flew in tight delta or V formations. However, the nationalist air forces gradually dropped this formation for looser ones, such as the finger four, fighting four, whatever you want to call it, that allowed pilots more flexibility to respond to situations and support each other. They also started to develop better energy fighting tactics that essentially used the superior speed, and particularly dive speed, of the aircraft to combat the more manoeuvrable Soviet fighters. The Republican air forces, however, stuck to the tight old formations and the turn fighting tactics with which they started the war. This did lead to some success for the Soviet aircraft, especially after the I-16 Type 10 armed with 4 machine guns started arriving. But ultimately, the poor training of the aircrews and the difficult nature of this aircraft to fly led to a very high attrition rate for the I-16 in Spain. And the inexperience of the crews kind of can't be underestimated. They generally got 5 months of training from learning to fly the aircraft for the very first time to being chucked into combat, and skill was lacking. The I-16 also fought in China, Manchuria and Mongolia under both the Soviet and nationalist Chinese flags. In China, the I-16s proved roughly equal to the Japanese A5M. The A5M was slightly more manoeuvrable, but the I-16 was faster, slightly, and more robust, as well as having slightly better firepower in some cases. However, the I-16 suffered heavy losses fighting against the Japanese Army's Ki-27, which was much more manoeuvrable than the I-16. The Soviets were eventually able to overcome these aircraft towards the end of the Battle of Karakin Gol, when the Soviets began using I-16s in massed formations during diving attacks to essentially overwhelm the slower but more manoeuvrable Japanese aircraft. They also started using rockets in the air-to-air role, killing a dozen or so Japanese aircraft, which is more interesting than important, but whatever. While the Soviets and Japanese would not fight directly after this battle, the I-16 continues to serve in the Nationalist Chinese Air Force, where it proved very effective against Japanese bombers, and as I said earlier, roughly equal to the Japanese fighters. The I-16 would also go on to serve in the Winter War against Finland and in the war against Germany, but I will leave these conflicts to a review of the I-16 late sometime in the future. In World of Warplanes, the I-16 reflects some of its historical counterparts' characteristics. It has a phenomenal rate of roll and a good rate of turn. While it is not the fastest aircraft in its tier, it is not very far behind the leaders in max speed, and while it is slow to dive, it has a very high rate of climb. Essentially, this is an aircraft which has no major weaknesses. The armament of this aircraft should be discussed first, as there are a number of decent weapons setups for this aircraft. Stock, the I-16 early has two 7.62mm machine guns. Personally, I find this armament to be a bit weak for Tier 3, but in this configuration with the top engine, you have the highest rate of climb in this tier, and you can almost turn with the Japanese A5M fighters. So it's still a valid option. I spent most of my battles in this aircraft with an armament of 4 7.62mm machine guns. In this configuration, you lose a little bit in rate of climb and turn compared to the previous setup, but in a comparative sense, you have basically the same performance as you did with 2 machine guns. Using the same logic, I flew my last 30 or so games in this aircraft with 4 82mm rockets as well. This causes a noticeable increase in your turn time, but you are still better at turning than all the other aircraft in your tier except for the F3F and the A5M. Plus the rockets were very useful in suppressing anti-aircraft fire when we were fighting in enemy territory. You can swap 2 of the 7.62mm machine guns for 2 12.7mm machine guns. However, in this configuration you are equal to the Bristol 133 in turn time, so I never tried that setup out as I valued the turn time of this aircraft too much. And of course, if you put rockets on as well as the 12.7mm machine guns, you are much slower than the Bristol 133 in terms of turning. However, I did briefly try this aircraft out with 2 12.7mm machine guns and no light machine guns. However, I found this to be a poor setup as it gives worse manoeuvrability than the 4 light machine gun setup with rockets. And I kind of didn't feel that the longer range of the guns really made up for that decline in manoeuvrability. Given all those different armament setups, you might think that the airspeed performance of this aircraft would vary dramatically, but you'd be mistaken. The I-16 has a top speed of 448 km per hour in all configurations, with a dive speed of 480. The rate of climb does vary, but is good in all configurations. However, the I-16 does seem to lose energy rapidly in turns, which limits its ability as an energy fighter, particularly when carrying rockets. Well, as does the low dive speed, but yeah. In terms of manoeuvrability, the I-16 is near the top of its tier. The F3F and A5M can consistently outturn the I-16. However, these 3 aircraft are far in advance of all the other aircraft in this tier. As I said, you'd have to load the heavy machine guns and the rockets before you become 4th placed. And all those other aircraft, the Americans, the Germans, and the British, they will try and turn fight you more often than not, even though they really can't keep up with you in that kind of fight. If you do get an F3F or A5M on your tail, you can prevent them from killing you for a long time by using your superior rate of roll to essentially stop them getting shots on you, and hopefully your team will arrive to help you out eventually. I performed very well in this aircraft. I won 63% of my 109 games, surviving to the end of more than half those matches. In those 109 games, I killed 209 enemy aircraft, got 45 assists, and destroyed 11 ground targets. Counting assists as half a kill, that gives me an average of 2.1 kills per game. At the moment, this is easily my best light fighter, with the F2F and the Spitfire Mark 1 a short distance behind. But really, this is all because the I-16 is really an overpowered aircraft that requires very little tactical nuance to fly well. I found tactics in this aircraft to be straightforward. You essentially dive onto the enemy's tail and do a yo-yo or two until your speed is comparable to your enemies. Then stick on their tail until they are dead. If someone shoots at you, you roll away and find another target. I've spent a number of games with someone essentially trying to stick on my tail the whole time, and still did very well by simply disengaging with my target and picking up another one every time I was fired at. Essentially a manoeuvrable enough that you can always basically keep out of line of fire of anything except for an A5M and an F3F. And over time, the damage you'll do just with those short bursts will add up, and playing conservatively in a manoeuvrable aircraft like this can keep you in the game for a very long time. One of my favourite tricks was doing a barrel roll around enemy fire, then turning onto their tail as they passed, but this is rather unnecessary as you can simply kind of weave your way under their line of fire. Defensively, both climbing and descending spirals can be useful, as you have a high rate of climb and low dive speed. However, when climbing, you have to watch your speed carefully, as the stall speed of 120 km an hour is higher than many other aircraft at this tier, in particular the A5M and the F3F. So, especially against A5M, climbing spirals probably not a good move because their rate of climb is at least comparable, possibly better than yours, and their rate of turn is better than yours, and their stall speed is lower, so you'll probably lose out in that sense, but otherwise it's an alright tactic. Otherwise, gameplay in this aircraft is just a combination of rolling, turning and shooting. If you can master when to do these three things, you should be able to rack up kills in this fighter in no time. And that's all I've got to say about the I-16 early. I hope you found this useful or otherwise enjoyed this video, and I'll see you all next time.